Thank you, Senator Bozeman. Thank you for your great partnership on development work in Africa and around the world over now so many years together. I think we've done this 13 years together. It's hard to believe, but thank you for coming today. If I might, while we wait to see if there's one more member who wants to join us, I'm going to ask a few more follow-up questions. I am specifically interested in vaccine production. One of the things that was striking to me about the arc of the global pandemic was that we faced a moment where vaccine nationalism emerged, and a number of countries in Europe and the United States prioritized the development of abundant available vaccines for their own population before meeting pledges that had been made to the developing world, partly because of developments in India. But it opened a critical window where both China and Russia offered vaccines that were less effective on complex terms that were often not favorable to the recipient country. And there was a 6 to 9 month period where I received dozens of pointed and sometimes desperate calls from heads of state pressing for access to vaccine technology. Vaccines are an important part of human development and public health. We are also likely at some point in our lives to face a comparable global pandemic. I'm wondering what initiatives have been taken to provide some investment or financing, or whether that's credible, in places around the developing world so that there's a more distributed global network of vaccine manufacturing.
Thank you, Senator. DFC, this was before I was there, but DFC pivoted and directed a huge amount of energy toward responding to the global pandemic. That did include supporting efforts for distributed vaccine manufacturing in Senegal, in South Africa, and in India. But now that the current pandemic has seemed to fade from the top of people's attention, we can't divert our focus from preparing for the next pandemic. Part of that is building resilient healthcare systems, and just the underlying development of countries, I think, is critical to that. But specifically on vaccines, we are looking at broadening some of the investments that we previously made to be beyond COVID-19 response vaccines, but instead be funding available for a broader approach for the basic sort of health of societies, for children and for development. We worked with Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. We provided them with a revolver in order to place orders for vaccines prior to donor nation commitments coming in. And we're working with them again to think about how to reimagine that relationship to be broader in the way that you exactly referred to.
I'd appreciate your keeping up with me on that development. One of the things we imagined when writing the BUILD Act was that having equity investment capabilities would also improve syndicating capabilities, partnering early stage with DFCs from the Nordic countries, from Japan, from South Korea, from our European partners. How is that proceeding? What are the limitations on it? Are there any additional supports you need, either for the interagency or in terms of your funding or legal authorities, that would help make that real?
It's clear that that was one of the goals behind the BUILD Act, and we've worked hard to fulfill this. And I think we're doing a good job. There's a lot of work ahead, though. Part of that is direct coordination. We've had numerous meetings with our counterparts at multiple levels, my level and at staff level, to find ways that we can get efficiencies on due diligence, on deal sharing. This has been a productive activity. There are some examples of specific frameworks that I think could produce great results. One is focused on Ukraine, and I don't want to get ahead of an announcement, but we announced in Japan during the G7 a collaboration between EBRD, DFC, and the other DFIs in the G7, and I think there's opportunities to broaden this out. Another is a deal that I mentioned in my opening statement, which, along with our Japanese and Australian counterparts, we were able to fund the acquisition of digital assets in the South Pacific. These assets had received an unsolicited offer from a Chinese firm. It was important to the Australians, and as a result, clearly strategically important to the Japanese and to us to support that effort. I think there's a lot more things like that we can do. It includes also some of the MDBs. So we're working closely with Inter-American Development Bank, with the EBRD, and others to find ways to share deal flow, to get more efficiencies and make greater impact.
As there is more and more conversation, and there's been some actions to revise the World Bank, its risk tolerance, its structure, its prioritization, similarly in the IMF. I'll be interested to have you keep me and others on this subcommittee up to date about that work in terms of the syndication. Two other quick questions, if I can, then I'll turn to my friend and colleague, Senator Merkley. I think countering corruption is an absolutely critical part of what you're doing. I'd welcome any input on how the offerings that you're making allow leaders in developing countries to not just have more transparency, better labor standards, better technology and skill transfer, but to push back on corruption, and what other supports or partnership you need from either State Department, more broadly, federal law enforcement, the private sector, to strengthen that piece of what you're bringing to the table. Because often the conversation about a large infrastructure project in a foreign country is complex. And there's some elements of a government that stand to benefit politically and professionally, and others that may stand to benefit personally. And those are very fraught conversations for a potential bidder, an American contractor, to engage in, and it requires subtle and complex conversations. How are we doing at bringing the best of your capabilities in terms of countering corruption to the fore?
Thanks for the question. I believe that our adherence to high standards is one of our competitive advantages, actually. I think you're exactly right that by having a commitment to high standards, labor, social, environmental, and integrity standards, it gives countries an opportunity to fight corruption, to highlight the problems they have, to contrast a difference. We work closely with Post. Our colleagues at embassies are critical for helping inform our work on many questions, but particularly this one. We work closely with the intelligence community for our KYC, our Know Your Customer, and other due diligence activities for vetting our potential partners. We have very high standards, and occasionally that means we have to pass on a deal, but more often than not, it means that we're able to improve the structure of a deal, the partners we deal with, and provide an example in the countries where we operate, where working with the private sector, we can really set the tone in the way that you said.
As we approach the 5th anniversary of the DFC next year, I'm interested in how you monitor that. Our ability to go around the world and say, we've got this great new tool, it's got great resources, it's delivering, is going to be tested. Folks will look back at some of the projects that have been financed and say, did they in fact meet higher labor standards, higher skill transfer, and higher transparency? How are you monitoring the outcomes of projects? And as you know, unfortunately, all too often, in looking across a big portfolio, critics or the media are inclined to pull out one or two out of hundreds of projects that may have failed to meet the projected goals. How are you monitoring the actual implementation on the ground over these 5 years?
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. Mistakes do happen, and we need to be prepared to handle them well. That's what makes the difference, right? By being open and transparent, by having process internally and externally for dealing with that. That's the key to mitigating the damage that a mistake or some future problem could have. You know, this is one of the things that the resources that this committee has provided us with has really helped bolster. Our Office of Development Policy is actually the biggest area in DFC. That's where our investment monitoring it takes place. We don't just need to do screening and analysis of the development impact and all of the various standard concerns we have before making the investment. We need to stay engaged and measure in precisely the way that you're mentioning. And when things happen, if we didn't catch them, we still need to have a mechanism, whether it's our public accountability mechanism, our openness with our Office of Inspector General, or other channels with our interagency partners, to make sure that when deals go in a direction that we wouldn't have wanted, that we handle that as effectively and proactively as possible.
I look forward to staying in touch with you about that, because anyone who's supervised a large portfolio of projects knows there's always a tail, there's always a few that go sideways. But as you said, exactly how you monitor, how you respond, and then how you change policies and practices are critical. Senator Merkley, thank you.